of the text, so much so that people in the modern world read texts almost always literally rather than symbolically. John Mill in the early 18th century, he had actually spent 30 years of his life, spent 30 years comparing the Greek manuscripts that were available to him. He also looked at the ancient translations of the New Testament into other languages, Latin and Syriac and Coptic, ancient versions of the New Testament, to see what their text said at different places. And he looked at how the New Testament was quoted by church fathers to see what their manuscripts must have looked like in their own day. Mill compiled the results of his collations of these manuscripts, and he published an edition of the New Testament in 1707 that included an apparatus of variant readings that he had discovered. He only included the differences that he found to be significant. To the shock and dismay of many of his contemporaries, Mill's apparatus indicated 30,000 places of variation among the manuscripts of the New Testament. And yet, scholars since the early 18th century have discovered many, many more variant readings among our surviving manuscripts, as manuscripts continue to be discovered even down till today. Gospel of Mark has a very interesting ending. Jesus has been crucified and buried. On the third day, the women go to the tomb, but they find the tomb empty. They see a man there in the tomb, and the man tells them to go tell the disciples that Jesus will go before them to Galilee. They're to meet him there. So Jesus has been raised. They're to meet him in Galilee. And then Mark chapter 16, verse 8 says, "But the women fled the tomb and didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid." That's where the gospel ends in the oldest and best manuscripts. The women don't tell anybody, and Jesus never appears to the disciples. Boom, end of story. Surely there were resurrection appearances, and so a number of scribes added endings to the Gospel of Mark, including the ending that's found in most of our English Bibles. Like the story of the woman taken in adultery, you know the story. Jesus is teaching in the temple, and the scribes and Pharisees bring a woman to him. They say to him, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. According to the law of Moses, she's to be stoned to death. What do you say? Jesus kneels down on the ground and starts writing in the dirt. And then they keep questioning him. He looks up and he says, "Let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her." The story was not originally found in the Gospel of John. It now occurs in John chapter 8. But in fact, in the oldest manuscripts of the Gospel of John, the story does not occur at all. And when you take the story out of the Gospel of John and you read from where it begins to where it ends and just leave it out, the flow of the story of John makes perfect sense, much better sense than it does with the story in it. In most modern English Bibles, you'll find that this ending is put in brackets. So the translator is telling you this is not an original ending, but is an ending that's been added on. Roman religions didn't have a Bible comparable to what Christianity later had and Judaism to some extent had. The earliest Christians did have scriptures, namely the Jewish scriptures, that eventually became the Old Testament as soon as Christians developed a separate set of scriptures that they called the New Testament. Christianity, unlike the other Roman religions, was an exclusivistic religion. In other words, Christianity insisted that it was right, and since it was the right religion, all other religions were wrong. Even Judaism is only a partial exception to this rule, because Jews did subscribe to their own religion, and they thought that their religion was right for Jews, but Jews, by and large, were not concerned to convert other people to believe in Judaism. Christians maintained that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, sent from the Jewish God to the Jewish people in fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures, and the only way to be right with this Jewish God, who is the only true God, is by accepting Jesus. Jews were considered and called Christ killers and a people fallen from grace. Christians then had to claim the ancient scriptures as their own, and they did so by pointing to the prophecies in these scriptures, prophecies that looked forward to Christ. so that Christ, according to the Christians, was anticipated in the Jewish scriptures. In the Gospel of Luke, we saw that when Jesus is being nailed to the cross, he prays to God, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." It's interesting that in the early church, this prayer was read as was interpreted as a prayer for God to forgive the Jews. Scribes in an age that had grown increasingly anti-Jewish didn't want Jesus to pray for the forgiveness of the Jews, since God obviously hadn't forgiven the Jews, and so they took out Jesus' prayer for the Jews. Early Christians wanted to convert as many people as they could as quickly as possible because the end was coming soon, and so there was an urgency in the mission of Paul and others. By the early 4th century, Christianity had almost completely separated off from Judaism, the religion of Jesus and his apostles. Although it started out as a sect of Judaism with Jesus himself and then his disciples, it was so widely rejected among Jews that it soon became a separate religion that went on the counterattack against its Jewish opponents. A good case can be made that it was the conversion of Constantine in the early 4th century that proved to be the single most important event of Christianity's first 300 years. A climactic moment on the one hand and the beginning of something entirely new on the other. One could well imagine that the majority of people living in the West today would still be pagan had Constantine not converted. By the end of the 4th century, it appears that Christianity was the religion of choice of fully half of the empire. It was this conversion that made Christianity the most powerful religious, historical, cultural, social, economic, and political force in the history of Western civilization, destined to change billions of lives. So that by the end of the 4th century, it was set to take over the world of its day, and to determine the course of Western civilization and history down to modern times, when it still exercises enormous influence over us all. Thank you.